let's begin working on our eye rig. What we'll do is make our character selectable, and let's go ahead and take a look at her eyes. So selecting our eye mesh, you can see that it is actually one mesh combined. But that's no problem at all because we will skin these eyes to a bone system. So let's go ahead and build those bones. And then in the next lesson, we'll create animation controls. All right, so what we'll do is go to wireframe mode, we'll go to component mode. We're going to work on the left eye first. What we need to do is find this eye center so that when we build an eye bone and start to rotate it, it will pivot the eye properly. If we do not find the right center, you'll notice that your eye will start to interpenetrate. So going back to wireframe mode, I'll go ahead and create a cluster. This is a great tool to use for finding an object center. And now what we could do is create a joint and align that joint to the cluster's position. So we could always use the joint tool or our command line. Let's go ahead and work with the command line. So to create a joint, we'll first want to deselect the cluster. That way, the joint will not be parented to the cluster. In our command line, we'll simply type the command joint and hit enter. So there is our eye joint. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and align it to the cluster. I'll go to the outliner, grab the cluster, grab the joint, and point constraint. Now we no longer need the cluster, so let's go ahead and remove it, and that will also clean up our point constraint. Okay, from here, let's move over to our side view, and we'll go ahead and bring the radius of this bone down to something more workable. Let's say to about 0.1. Now, even though we have matched the joint to this object center, that's not the exact center of this eye. You can see that parts of the eye mesh have been removed to optimize the mesh further. When you're building these game assets, if something is not going to be seen, well, you'll want to remove it in order to make sure that your assets do not affect performance. All right, so with that being said, we can still find the center of this eye. We'll basically look for the midline. Here it is. So you can see from here, afterwards, things start to taper down. So this helps us to find that midpoint. So we weren't too far from it. Let's go ahead and take our eye joint and move that back to this midline. All right, so from here, we can go ahead and rename the joint to BN, since it will be bound, underscore L underscore I01. So this is the left eye bone. All right. I'll now duplicate this object and create an end joint with it. So with the duplicated joint, we'll go ahead and move that forward to the front part of this eye. And let's go ahead and bring down its radius. It might be easier to just type in a value. So I'll go ahead and put in a 0.05. So it's a little bit smaller than its parent, and now we'll parent back to the parent bone. We may need to go back to object mode. So we'll hit F8 on our keyboard and parent the child bone again to its parent. And what this helps us to do is have direction. Not only that, but we'll need an end joint for the way we will rig the eyes to follow the control objects we'll create in the next lesson. Okay, well, now that that's in place, we'll grab our end joint and rename that. Since it will not be skinned to, we'll give it a prefix of BE for bone end, LI01. Okay, great. Now, as we're building these assets, you can see that, all right, everything's pointed the way it should, but the orientation of the joint is not consistent with the rest of this chain, meaning that the X is pointed down in the entire skeleton, So in our case, we'd want to stay consistent, and this is mainly for reading animation in the graph editor. It's just a little bit easier to read F-curves this way if we consider the orientation of each joint and try to keep it as consistent as possible. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at the orientation of this eye in the front view. So you can see that X right now is actually pointed to the side. So you have different tools to correct that. You could always go to Skeleton, Orient Joint Options. I'll reset the settings, and you can use the default settings to have that happen. Notice now X is pointed forward. Now this tool is not going to affect the end joint. So in order to have that happen, we'll need to go to our attribute editor and go ahead and zero out our joint orient attributes in order to make sure the end joint matches the orientation of the parent. So if you needed to apply that tool to an entire chain, it's going to affect the entire chain except for the end joint. So that's just something to keep in mind. But it's no problem at all. We just simply go in and zero out our joint orient attributes to correct that problem. All right, great. So let's say we go ahead and take our eye bone and parent that to the head. So now it's a part of our skeleton. We can go ahead and mirror it over. Let me go ahead and show you my mirror joint tools or settings. So under skeleton, we'll head over to the mirror joint options, and I will go ahead and reset things just so we can work with this from the top and understand the mentality behind choosing some good settings for mirroring your joints across. So if you want a mirrored effect, meaning if you were to, let's say, rotate the eye in the y-axis on the left side, it would be mirrored on the right side, yet at the same time using the same value. If you want that type of effect, what you'd want to do is use behavior. Again, it helps for reading animation if the skeleton were ever to be baked down. Now for our mirror plane, we're going to want to use the YZ axis. To rename the joint for the right side, we can have the system search for _L_ that defines the left side and replace with _R_ for the right. So now when we choose mirror, notice everything has been renamed. And just to take a look at this, grabbing both joints, if we were to rotate, notice that mirroring effect. All right, very neat. So to finish up, let's say we go ahead and skin our eye mesh to these joints. It won't take hardly any time. So it's just a matter of grabbing our eye mesh, shift selecting both bones, and choosing skin, bind skin, smooth bind options. I'll reset the settings. And what we'll do is go ahead and work with the settings we'll use for binding the entire character. So we'll go ahead and set that now. So what we'll do is use selected joints for our bind to method. Our bind method, we'll go ahead and set that to closest distance, which is a more accurate bind as it looks at the distance between our joints and the vertices the joints will affect. Our skinning method we'll leave at classic linear. Our normalizing weights mode, let's go ahead and set that to interactive, which keeps the weights normalized so they equal to 100%. Now for our max influence count, typically we want to use a value of 4 or less, so I'll go ahead and set this to 4, and I'll keep on maintain max influence so that we never go past this value. Okay, so at this point we can go ahead and choose bind skin. And this is just a one-to-one weight. So for instance, we'll grab our eye mesh on the left side. Let's go ahead and go to component mode. We can now go to our component editor, and to reweight this, let's make sure we're under our smooth skin tab. It's really simple. We just find our left eye bone, select the first section, shift select the last, and put in a value of 1 just to double check to make sure that all of those points are fully weighted to this eye bone. And we'll do the same thing for the right side. We'll grab all of those components. We'll grab the first column, Shift select to add the last column and everything else between, and put in a value of 1. So, as simple as that. So now you'll see that the eyes are now being controlled by our eye bone, and the pivot is in the right spot. Okay, great. So let's say we build some eye controls in the next lesson.